Luna Sinclair pulled the collar of her leather jacket higher around her neck, her gloved fingers clutching the strap of her camera bag. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she ignored it. The thrill of a story, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, it was a rush she couldn't live without. She paused at the mouth of an alley, checking her phone. Her contact, a low-level informant named Benny, was supposed to meet her here half an hour ago. Typical, she thought, blowing out a frustrated breath. Benny had a knack for being fashionably late, but this was excessive, even for him. "Where are you?" she muttered. Suddenly, the air changed. It was subtle, a whisper of something primal and unsettling. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Luna was used to danger. She'd been in plenty of scrapes before, but this felt different. The night had eyes, hungry, unseen eyes that watched and waited. "Come on, Benny," she whispered. "You better not have flaked on me." Footsteps echoed from the darkness behind her, slow and deliberate. Luna tensed, her muscles coiling like a spring. She turned, her hand slipping inside her jacket where she kept her pepper spray. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, dressed in an immaculate black coat that seemed to melt into the night. The man's presence was magnetic, pulling at the corners of her awareness, and Luna's breath caught in her throat. His eyes, God, his eyes, gleamed a molten gold under the flickering street lamp. They were too intense, too knowing, as if he could read every secret she'd ever kept. His features were flawless, almost inhumanly so, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and lips that curved into a smirk. "Lost, little bird." His voice was velvet, smooth and dangerous. Luna gritted her teeth. "I'm not lost, and I'm not your little bird." The man tilted his head, an amused expression flickering across his face. Brave words for someone wandering alone in the dark. She pulled out her pepper spray, her hand steady. "Back off." His smile widened, but it was a predator's smile. "That won't help you." Before she could react, he moved. It was faster than anything she'd ever seen. One moment he was standing a few feet away, and the next he was right in front of her. Her heart hammered wildly as he wrapped a cold iron grip around her wrist, forcing her to drop the canister. "Let me go," she shouted, kicking at him. He caught her effortlessly, his strength inhuman, and a flicker of panic wormed its way into her chest. "You're feisty," he said, leaning in. His breath was cool against her skin, and she could see the sharp gleam of his fangs. "But you really shouldn't be out here." A strangled sound escaped her lips. Fangs. Vampire. The word rang in her head, and every logical part of her brain screamed that it was impossible. Vampires weren't real. They were the stuff of myths and horror stories. Yet here he was, a creature of the night holding her captive with a strength she couldn't fight. He studied her as if considering something. Then, abruptly, he released her. Luna stumbled back, clutching her wrist and glaring at him, trying to mask her fear with fury. "What the hell are you?" she demanded. The man's smile faded, replaced by an expression that was almost weary, a warning. He stepped back into the shadows, his form blurring, becoming one with the darkness. "Go home, Luna Sinclair. Your curiosity will get you killed." Her blood ran cold. "How do you know my name?" But he was gone, leaving only the echo of his voice in the empty alley. Luna's knees trembled, and she sank against the brick wall, gasping for breath. She rubbed her wrist where his touch had left an icy burn, her mind racing. Vampires. The rational part of her wanted to deny it, to chalk it up to a prank or her imagination. But she couldn't ignore the raw terror she'd felt. And how had he known her name? "Pull yourself together," she thought. "You're a journalist, not some damsel in distress." Shoving her fear aside, she retrieved her camera bag and started back toward her car. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start looking. If Benny was missing, it meant her story was bigger and more dangerous than she'd imagined. And she wasn't about to back down. The fluorescent lights of the newsroom flickered, casting ghostly shadows over the cubicles. It was past midnight, and the office was nearly deserted, save for a handful of bleary-eyed editors hunched over their desks. Luna's boots clacked softly against the polished floor as she made her way to her own cluttered workspace, her mind still racing from the encounter in the alley. Dropping into her chair, she booted up her laptop, fingers trembling as she navigated to her research notes. She had files on every significant case she'd worked, from corrupt city officials to underground fight clubs, but her latest project had taken a strange, sinister turn. When she'd first started digging into the disappearances, it had seemed like another story about crime and neglect, the kind that the city was infamous for sweeping under the rug. Now, everything felt more ominous. She pulled up a document titled Project Nightshade and scrolled through the list of missing persons. 15 names, all young adults, all vanished within the last 3 months. The police had offered little explanation, treating the cases as unrelated runaways, but Luna's gut told her otherwise. Something connected them, something dark. Her phone buzzed, startling her out of her thoughts. She grabbed it, expecting another message from a nervous source or perhaps a snarky comment from her editor. Instead, an unknown number flashed on the screen. Luna hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Luna Sinclair," a voice drawled, male, smooth, and unsettlingly familiar. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the vampire from the alley. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. A soft chuckle echoed through the line. "I warned you to leave this alone. You should be more careful. Yeah? Well, I don't take orders from vampires," she shot back, her heart hammering. "If you think you can intimidate me, think again." He paused, and she imagined his golden eyes narrowing in irritation. "Your bravery is admirable but foolish. You're meddling in matters you don't understand." Luna gripped the phone tighter. "Then explain it to me. What's really happening in this city?" A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Finally, he sighed. "You want answers? Meet me at Ravenwood Park tomorrow night, midnight. Come alone." "Or what?" she challenged. "You'll come find me?" His voice dropped to a whisper, dangerously close. "There are worse things in the dark than me, little bird. I suggest you don't keep them waiting." The line went dead, leaving Luna staring at her phone. Her pulse roared in her ears, adrenaline and anger warring within her. She'd never felt so frustrated, so utterly out of her depth. But she wouldn't be scared off. If anything, her resolve hardened. Whatever this was, she would get to the bottom of it, even if it meant facing monsters. The next day, a pale autumn sun filtered through the windows of the city central library, where Luna had gone to gather her thoughts and, hopefully, some leads. The library was her sanctuary, a place where knowledge whispered from shelves that stretched toward the vaulted ceiling. Today, though, even this sacred space couldn't fully calm her nerves. She'd been poring over books and ancient folklore about vampires, hoping for some clue that could prepare her for her meeting at Ravenwood Park. As she skimmed through a particularly dusty tome, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Detective Marlo. "Marlo, got your message. Benny's a ghost. No sightings, no leads. Be careful, Sinclair. This is bigger than you think." Luna's stomach twisted. Benny, her usually reliable informant, had been her first link to the missing persons case. If he was gone, then she was running out of sources. "Damn it," she whispered, running a hand through her hair. "Researching monsters, are we?" A soft, lilting voice interrupted her thoughts. Luna looked up to see an elegant woman standing on the other side of the table. Her raven-black hair cascaded in glossy waves over a crimson velvet coat, and her emerald eyes sparkled with an unsettling knowledge. She was beautiful, but there was something about her that made Luna's skin prickle. "Who's asking?" Luna replied, closing the book cautiously. The woman's red-painted lips curled into a smile. "Evangeline, I've heard you've taken quite an interest in our kind." Luna tensed. "Our kind?" Evangeline's gaze flickered to the book before settling back on Luna. "Vampires, of course. But you should know, child, that knowledge often comes at a price." Great, Luna thought. Another cryptic supernatural. "Look, I'm just trying to get to the truth. People are dying or disappearing, and no one seems to care. If you have something useful to tell me, I'm all ears." Evangeline's smile faded. She leaned in, her voice lowering to a whisper. "The truth is that this city is a graveyard for secrets. The ones who disappear are merely the sacrifices in a much older game. And you, my dear, are dangerously close to becoming the next." Luna swallowed. Then help me. What's happening in Ravenwood Park tomorrow night? Evangeline's eyes darkened. Damon Blackthorne has his reasons for luring you there. Whether they are noble or nefarious remains to be seen. But tread carefully, Luna Sinclair. The prophecy. She stopped, her expression momentarily unreadable. Ah, but that's a tale for another time. Wait, Luna pressed, her frustration peaking. What prophecy? Evangeline straightened, her features once again serene and aloof. It's not my place to say. But remember this, the line between salvation and damnation is very thin, and even love can lead you to ruin. Before Luna could respond, Evangeline turned and melted into the crowd of library patrons, leaving Luna more confused and on edge than before. With each new encounter, the mystery only deepened, and the stakes climbed higher. She exhaled shakily, returning her gaze to the book in front of her. One thing was clear, whatever awaited her at Ravenwood Park would change everything, and she needed to be ready. As twilight bled into night, the city transformed. The streets grew quieter, a hush settling over everything as darkness seeped into the corners. Ravenwood Park lay on the outskirts, where nature had reclaimed its dominion. Towering oak trees loomed like sentinels, their twisted branches silhouetted against the pale moonlight. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and a faint mist curled over the ground. Luna parked her car at the edge of the woods, her pulse thrumming with anticipation and dread. She pulled a flashlight from her bag and checked her phone one last time. No new messages. The police scanner app she'd left running was silent, and her backup plan, telling Marlo to look for her if she didn't check in by dawn, felt flimsy at best. With a resigned sigh, she zipped her jacket and stepped out into the night. Her footsteps crunched over dead leaves as she entered the park, the flashlight beam slicing through the thickening mist. Everything seemed to hold its breath, and the oppressive stillness pressed in around her. She had reached the heart of the park when she heard it, a whisper, barely audible, slipping through the fog. Luna turned, the flashlight illuminating empty air. Her grip on the light tightened. There was no one there, but the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Luna Sinclair, a voice drawled, smooth and familiar. Her heart jumped into her throat. Damon Blackthorne stepped out of the mist, his presence commanding and unsettling. He wore a dark, tailored coat that accentuated his lean, powerful frame, and his molten gold eyes gleamed like a predator's. In the moonlight, his features seemed even sharper, more ethereal and dangerous. "You actually showed up," he mused, his gaze raking over her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Brave or foolish, I can't decide which." "Probably both," she replied, forcing her voice to stay steady. "You wanted to talk, so talk." He arched an eyebrow, a hint of amusement curving his lips. "Impatient, aren't we?" Luna crossed her arms. "People are missing. I don't have time for games." Damon's smile vanished, replaced by a more serious expression. "The people who have gone missing are victims of a power struggle. My world, our world, is not as simple as you imagine. There are ancient rivalries, factions that fight for dominance, and humans who become collateral damage. So it is vampires behind the disappearances," she said, her stomach churning. "Yes and no." He took a step closer, and she instinctively backed up. "Some of us follow a code. We don't harm humans unless necessary. But others have no such reservations." Luna's anger flared. "So you just let it happen? You let innocent people die because of your petty politics?" A muscle in his jaw tightened. "Do you think I don't care?" His voice was low, strained. "I've spent centuries trying to keep order among my kind, to prevent senseless bloodshed. But there are limits to even my power." She held his gaze, searching for any hint of deception. To her surprise, she found none, only a shadow of regret, perhaps even sorrow, lurking behind his golden eyes. It made her hesitate, her resolve wavering. "Why me?" she finally asked. "Why did you tell me to stay away?" He exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. "Because you are more important than you realize. There is something about you, something that draws the attention of those who seek to use or destroy. I wanted to protect you, but you are stubborn." "Protect me from what?" she demanded. Damon hesitated, then tilted his head. "From him." The air shifted, a cold gust sweeping through the trees. Luna spun around, her flashlight beam catching a new figure emerging from the shadows. This man was taller, more imposing, with eyes like frozen steel and a smile that dripped malice. "Well, well," the newcomer said, his voice a cold, taunting drawl. "Damon, keeping secrets from me again? How typical." Luna's blood ran cold. Even without an introduction, she knew who he was. Alexander Crow, Damon's estranged brother and rival. His presence was suffocating, like a storm rolling in, and his eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger that made her want to run. "Alexander?" Damon greeted, his voice hard as stone. "I didn't invite you." Alexander chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "No, but I couldn't resist. You see, your little journalist here has been causing quite the stir, asking all the wrong questions. And you know how much I hate loose ends." He looked at Luna, his gaze stripping her bare. "Such a shame," he murmured. "You're quite lovely, but I'm afraid you've meddled too far and now you have to pay the price." Damon moved in a blur, positioning himself between Luna and his brother. "You won't touch her." Alexander's smile widened. "Oh, is that a challenge, brother?" The tension between them was palpable, a crackling energy that made Luna's heart pound. She felt trapped, a pawn in a deadly game she barely understood, but she couldn't let herself freeze. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, searching for anything that could help. A small silver knife she carried for emergencies, her last feeble defense. "Enough," Damon said, his voice like a whip crack. "This isn't the place for our feud." Alexander sighed theatrically. "Always the noble one, aren't you? But tonight, I'm not here for a fight. I'm here to give her a warning." His gaze settled on Luna. "Walk away from this little human. Dig any deeper, and you'll find nothing but death." Luna's hands trembled, but she refused to back down. "I'm not afraid of you." He tilted his head, a mocking gleam in his eyes. "You should be, but I'll enjoy watching your courage falter when the truth finally breaks you." With that, he stepped back into the shadows, vanishing as suddenly as he'd appeared. The oppressive energy lifted, but Luna felt no relief. She turned to Damon, her heart still racing. "What does he want?" she demanded. Damon's shoulders were tense, his expression grim. "Power, control, revenge. Alexander will stop at nothing to see me, and those I care about, destroyed." Luna took a shaky breath. "Why do I feel like I'm just a pawn in all of this?" He looked at her, something unreadable in his gaze. "Because you're more than a pawn, Luna. You're the key to everything." The next day, Luna sat in her apartment, the morning light streaming through the window. Sleep had eluded her, and she'd spent the hours since her encounter at Ravenwood Park replaying everything Damon and Alexander had said. Her mind buzzed with questions, but one thing was clear: she needed more information. Her laptop lay open on the coffee table, the screen filled with articles on vampire mythology and the ancient rivalries she'd only begun to understand. Names of clans and old bloodlines, rumors of ancient prophecies, none of it made sense yet, but the pieces were beginning to form a pattern. A soft knock at her door jolted her from her thoughts. Luna frowned, grabbing her knife and tucking it into her pocket before approaching the peephole. Relief and surprise flooded through her when she saw Detective Marlo standing in the hallway. "Detective?" she said, opening the door. "What are you doing here?" Marlo looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was hoping we could talk. Mind if I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. He crossed the threshold, glancing around her cluttered apartment. "You've been busy," he remarked, nodding at the stacks of papers and books. "Yeah, you could say that." Luna shut the door, crossing her arms. "What's going on?" He sighed, sinking onto her worn-out couch. "Benny's officially been classified as missing. But I've got this gut feeling that whatever he was on to ties back to your investigation. And you, Luna, you're in deeper than I think even you realize." Her stomach twisted. "I know. Things have gotten complicated." Marlo's gaze sharpened. "Complicated how? You said something about vampires in your last voicemail. Was that a joke, or—" "It wasn't," she interrupted, sitting down across from him. "I know it sounds crazy, but everything points to them being real. And there's more. There's some kind of power struggle happening among them, and I'm caught in the middle." Marlo rubbed his temples. Vampires. God, I must be losing my mind to even consider it. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. Look, if what you're saying is true, then we need a plan. I'm not letting you take this on alone. Luna felt a spark of hope. You believe me? He sighed again, a weary smile tugging at his lips. I believe that something's out there, something dangerous. And I'm not about to let it get you killed. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Meet me at the old church tonight. Come prepared. Luna's heart skipped a beat. Evangeline, the elegant, enigmatic vampire from the library. It was another chance to get answers, but the thought of what lay ahead sent a chill down her spine. She looked at Marlo, determination hardening her voice. Then, let's get ready. We have a meeting to attend. The sun had set, painting the city in shadow, by the time Luna and Detective Marlo reached the old church. Once a place of worship, it now stood abandoned, a crumbling monument to forgotten faith. Ivy climbed the stone walls, and shattered stained glass windows cast fractured colors onto the moss-covered ground. The wind whispered through the ruins, carrying the scent of damp stone and rotting leaves. Luna glanced at Marlo, who had a hand resting on the holster of his gun, his eyes scanning their surroundings. He looked skeptical but determined, and she drew some courage from his steady presence. Despite everything, she felt a little safer having him there. Creepy, he murmured, his voice low. Are you sure this is the place? Luna nodded, clutching her silver knife tighter. Yeah, she said to come prepared, so keep your guard up. They crossed the threshold into the nave, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. The pews were overturned, some shattered into splinters, and the altar had been reduced to a crumbling slab of stone. Moonlight streamed through the broken windows, illuminating dust motes that swirled like tiny ghosts. A sound echoed from the shadows, a soft scrape, like a footstep. Luna's heart leapt into her throat, and she turned, knife at the ready. Relax, child. Evangeline's voice drifted from the darkness. The vampire emerged from behind a pillar, her red velvet coat billowing around her like a cloak. Her emerald eyes gleamed with a strange light, and her presence seemed to fill the room with an unnatural stillness. You brought company, Evangeline noted, her gaze flicking to Marlo. A brave but foolish choice. Marlo straightened, his hand tightening on his gun. I'm here to protect her. Evangeline's lips curled into a half-smile. How noble! But against our kind, your weapons are little more than toys. Luna stepped forward, cutting through the tension. Evangeline, we're here because we need answers. No more cryptic warnings or half-truths. Tell me what's going on, and why I'm supposedly so important. Evangeline's expression softened slightly, and she tilted her head. Very well, but know that the truth is not a comfort, it is a burden. She gestured to a shattered pew. Sit. This may take a while. Luna and Marlo exchanged a wary glance but obeyed, sitting side by side on the worn wood. Evangeline remained standing, her presence regal and unearthly. Centuries ago, Evangeline began, long before this city was built, there were 3 ancient vampire clans that ruled these lands, the Blackthorn, Crow, and Lysander clans. They kept a fragile balance of power, upheld by blood and secrets. But prophecies have a way of disrupting order. Luna leaned forward, hanging on to every word. What prophecy? Evangeline's emerald eyes locked onto hers. A prophecy foretelling the rise of a human born with the blood of an ancient. This human would hold the key to either uniting the clans in peace or tearing them apart in war. Their bloodline would be the bridge between mortal and immortal, and their destiny would change the fate of all vampires. Marlo frowned. And you think Luna is this? Chosen human? Evangeline's gaze was heavy with meaning. I know she is. Her lineage is not as ordinary as she believed. Her ancestors were part of the old magic, guardians of secrets that even vampires feared. That is why Damon Blackthorn has taken an interest in her. He senses the power in her blood. Luna's mouth went dry. That can't be true. My family was normal. My mother was a school teacher, and my dad, he worked in construction. Evangeline's expression turned sympathetic. Do you know much about your ancestors beyond your parents? Your family history is shrouded in mystery, for good reason." Marlo's eyes narrowed. "And if what you're saying is true, what does Alexander Crow want with her?" Evangeline's smile vanished. "Power. If he can claim Luna, if he can control her or drain her of her magic, he could bend the prophecy to his will and take over both the human and vampire worlds. He would become unstoppable." A cold wave of fear washed over Luna. "So that's why he's after me. But why now?" Evangeline's gaze hardened. "Because the time of the prophecy has come. The signs are all around us, the blood moon, the unrest among the clans, and your awakening abilities. Damon wants to protect you, but even he may not be strong enough to shield you from the storm that is coming." Luna's head spun, disbelief and terror warring inside her. "Abilities? What abilities?" Evangeline stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Have you felt anything strange lately? An unusual sense of intuition, dreams that feel too vivid to be mere fantasies, or bursts of strength or perception?" Luna swallowed hard. The alleyway flashed in her mind. How she'd known Damon was watching her before she'd even seen him. How she'd felt a surge of adrenaline that had made her heart race faster than seemed natural. And the dreams. Vivid, haunting dreams she hadn't thought much about until now. "Yes," she whispered, "but I thought it was just stress." Evangeline looked almost pitying. "Stress, perhaps, but it is the magic of your bloodline waking up. You are changing, Luna, and soon you will be forced to choose your path." The realization left her breathless. All her life she'd wanted to uncover the truth, to chase the stories no one else dared to. Now she was the story, and the truth felt too heavy to bear. Marlo reached over, his hand a solid, comforting weight on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice firm. "You're not alone in this." Evangeline's eyes softened, but the moment was shattered when the church doors slammed open. The wind howled through the nave, carrying a familiar, taunting voice. "Ah, there you are. I knew I'd find you eventually." Luna's heart dropped as Alexander Crow strode into the church, his long coat billowing and his icy eyes glinting with malicious delight. Behind him, shadows seemed to writhe, as if alive. "Alexander," Evangeline said, her voice a sharp warning. "You are trespassing." He smirked, his gaze sweeping over the trio. "And you're playing at guardian angel? How quaint. But I'm not here for you, Evangeline. I'm here for her." He looked at Luna, his gaze like a blade slicing through the air. Marlo rose, drawing his gun. "Stay back," he ordered, aiming it at Alexander. The vampire laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "Human weapons? How adorable. You think you can stop me with that?" Before Marlo could fire, Alexander moved. He was a blur, faster than Luna's eyes could track, and in the next heartbeat, he had Marlo pinned against a broken pillar, the gun clattering to the ground. "Let him go!" Luna shouted, her voice cracking with panic. Alexander tightened his grip on Marlo's throat. "And why should I? He's nothing but a nuisance." Luna's hands trembled, rage and fear boiling inside her. Her vision blurred and something inside her snapped. The air around her grew heavy, charged with a crackling energy she couldn't explain. The shadows in the church shifted, bending toward her, and for a moment, Alexander faltered, his eyes narrowing in surprise. "What is this?" Releasing Marlo and stepping back, Evangeline's eyes widened and she murmured, "Her power, it's awakening." Luna didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it, a warmth, a strength surging through her veins, ancient and wild. The world seemed to slow, and she met Alexander's gaze, her fear replaced by a fierce, unyielding will. "Get away from him," she commanded, her voice echoing strangely in the empty church. Alexander's smirk wavered, and he took another step back, as if the very air around her repelled him. His eyes glittered with newfound interest. "So, the little bird has claws. How delightful." He gave a mocking bow, his gaze never leaving hers. "Enjoy your moment of defiance, Luna Sinclair. It won't last." With a final, taunting smile, he melted into the shadows, vanishing as suddenly as he'd arrived. The oppressive energy in the church lifted, and Luna's knees buckled. Marlo caught her just in time, his grip steadying her. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etched into his face. Luna nodded weakly, the strange energy fading as quickly as it had come. I think so. Evangeline approached, her expression unreadable. You are more powerful than even I suspected. But this is only the beginning, Luna. The darkness is coming, and you must learn to wield your magic, or it will consume you. Luna swallowed, her throat dry. Her world had changed irrevocably, and the weight of her newfound destiny pressed down on her. But as she looked at Marlo and at Evangeline, she knew she couldn't give up. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it, even if it meant embracing the darkness within. The church was silent once again, but the air remained thick with the aftermath of Alexander's presence. Luna stood on shaky legs, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the surge of power she had just experienced. Her mind swirled with questions, but she pushed them aside. For now, survival was all that mattered. Evangeline stepped forward, her green eyes narrowing in thought as she regarded Luna. You need to learn control, she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency that Luna couldn't ignore. Your magic is wild, and if you don't master it, it will make you a target even more than you already are. Luna's hands were still trembling, and she rubbed them together, trying to steady herself. How? She whispered. How am I supposed to control something I don't even understand? Evangeline considered her for a moment, then turned her gaze to Marlo, who was still breathing heavily from his encounter with Alexander. Your human protector won't be enough, she continued, almost as if to herself. You'll need someone who knows our world, someone who can teach you. Marlo scowled, his jaw clenched. You mean Damon, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. We're supposed to trust another vampire? One who's clearly hiding things from us? Evangeline raised an eyebrow. Damon Blackthorne is one of the few who adheres to a strict code of honor. While his motives may be complex, he values the balance between our worlds. If anyone can help Luna, it's him. Luna thought about Damon's golden eyes, the way he seemed to carry centuries of grief and burden in his gaze. He was dangerous, yes, but there had been something else there, something that made her want to trust him even when she knew she shouldn't. What about you? Luna asked, her voice quiet. You seem to know a lot about this. Can't you help me? Evangeline's expression softened. I can guide you, yes, but my influence among the clans is limited, and my position is precarious. Alexander and his followers see me as a threat, and if I get too involved, it could put us all in even greater danger. Besides, she added with a wry smile, your bond with Damon is already forming. You'll need to confront it sooner or later. Luna's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, feeling an odd sense of betrayal at the mention of a bond. She hadn't asked for this connection, and yet it was shaping her fate in ways she couldn't control. Marlo interrupted her thoughts. If Damon's our only option, then how do we find him? He sounded skeptical, but his determination to protect Luna never wavered. Evangeline's gaze darkened. He'll come to you when the time is right, but for now, there is one more thing you must understand. The vampire reached into her coat and pulled out a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. She held it out to Luna, who hesitated before accepting it. This belonged to one of the last human-born guardians of our world, Evangeline explained. It will offer you some protection, but it also carries a heavy responsibility. By wearing it, you are accepting your role, even if you don't fully understand it yet. Luna stared at the pendant, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It was beautiful, delicate, and somehow familiar, as if it had always been a part of her. She slipped it over her head, and a warmth spread through her chest, calming some of the residual fear and uncertainty. Thank you, she murmured, looking back up at Evangeline. I won't let it go to waste. Evangeline's eyes gleamed with an emotion Luna couldn't quite name. I hope you keep that promise, she said softly. Because there are forces in this world that will stop at nothing to see you fall. After leaving the old church, Luna and Marlo made their way back to her apartment, the city now cloaked in midnight shadows. They were both exhausted, their bodies and minds worn thin from the night's events. But there was no room for rest. The threats around them were too close, and the knowledge Luna had gained felt like a ticking time bomb. Marlo slumped onto her couch, his head in his hands. This is insane, he muttered. Vampires, ancient prophecies, magic. How are we supposed to fight something like this? Luna sank into the armchair opposite him, rubbing her temples. I don't know, she admitted. But we can't just give up. We need a plan, a way to stay ahead of Alexander and whatever else is coming. Marlo's eyes lifted to hers, and she could see the worry and protectiveness in his gaze. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, Luna, but this is too big for either of us alone. The pendant around her neck felt heavier than before, and she gripped it, drawing strength from the warmth it emitted. Then we find Damon, she said, the resolve in her voice surprising even herself. If he really can help, we need him. And I need answers. Marlo sat back, a reluctant acceptance settling over him. Fine, but I'm not letting you out of my sight. If that vampire tries anything, he won't, Luna interrupted, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Deep down, she knew Damon wouldn't hurt her, even if she still didn't fully understand why. Before they could say anything else, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Both of them jumped, and Marlo's hand immediately went to his gun. He gestured for Luna to stay back as he approached the door, but she followed, unable to ignore the dread curling in her gut. Marlo checked the peephole, his expression turning grim. It's him. Luna's heart skipped a beat. Damon? Marlo nodded and, with a sigh, unlocked the door. Damon Blackthorne stepped inside, his presence commanding and unsettling as ever. His golden eyes swept the room, lingering on Luna with an intensity that made her breath catch. Forgive the intrusion, he said, his voice smooth and composed. But time is not on our side. Luna crossed her arms, trying to mask her nervousness. You always show up when it's least convenient. We were just talking about you. Damon's lips quirked into a humorless smile. I'm flattered. He looked at Marlo, who was still glaring at him with distrust. Detective, I'm sure you're eager to protect her, but if you're going to survive what's coming, you'll need to trust me. Marlo's jaw tightened. Trust is earned, not given freely. And right now, you haven't done much to earn mine. Damon's expression darkened. Fair enough, but whether you like it or not, we're on the same side. He turned back to Luna. Evangeline told you about the prophecy? Yes, Luna replied, her voice steady. She also said I need to learn to control my abilities. Damon's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You do, and quickly. Alexander is growing more aggressive, and now that he knows what you're capable of, he'll be relentless in his pursuit. Then teach me, Luna said, her voice resolute. I'm tired of being a pawn in this game. If I'm supposed to have this power, then I want to know how to use it. Damon studied her, and for a moment, something like admiration flickered in his gaze. Very well, but understand this, training will not be easy. You'll face things that will terrify you, and you may wish you had never learned the truth. Luna swallowed, but her resolve didn't waver. I'm not afraid. Liar, he whispered, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Everyone is afraid of something. Marlo cleared his throat, breaking the tension. If you're going to train her, where do we start? Damon's expression grew serious. Not here. It's too dangerous. There's a place on the outskirts of the city, a sanctuary warded against intruders. We'll be safer there. Marlo looked skeptical. And we're just supposed to follow you blindly? Damon's gaze turned cold. You're free to stay behind, detective. But I assure you, Alexander won't hesitate to finish what he started if he finds you alone. Marlo bristled, but he didn't argue. Luna placed a hand on his arm, trying to offer some reassurance. It'll be okay, she said softly, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. We have to try, he sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Fine, but I'm holding you to your word, Blackthorne. If anything happens to her, You'll what? Damon interrupted, his tone mildly amused. You're brave, detective, I'll give you that. But let's not pretend you're a match for me. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Luna stepped between them, her voice firm. Enough, we're on the same side, remember? Damon's eyes lingered on hers, and he inclined his head slightly. As you wish. They packed quickly, Luna grabbing what little she needed, a change of clothes, her journal, and the silver knife Evangeline had given her. Damon waited outside, his gaze distant as he watched the empty street, as if sensing for threats lurking in the darkness. When they were ready, Damon led the way. They left the city, driving in silence as the urban landscape gave way to dense woods and winding roads. The moonlight painted the world in silver and shadow, and the tension in the car was palpable. Luna sat in the back seat, her eyes flicking between Marlo, who was gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, and Damon, who seemed perfectly at ease in the passenger seat. She wondered how he could be so calm when everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked, breaking the silence. Damon turned slightly, his eyes catching the moonlight. "A safe house, one that has stood for centuries. It belonged to the first Guardians, and it's shielded from prying eyes, both mortal and immortal." Marlo's voice was tight. "And how do we know it's still safe? You're expecting us to trust a place that's centuries old?" Damon's smile was fleeting. "Because I've kept it warded. You'll have to trust me on that." Marlo muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. Luna felt the weight of the pendant around her neck and found herself silently praying that Damon was right. As they drove deeper into the woods, the road narrowed and the air grew colder. The forest seemed almost alive, whispering secrets that only the trees could understand. Finally, Damon instructed Marlo to turn onto a hidden dirt path, barely visible in the moonlight. The car came to a stop in front of a stone house, half hidden by overgrown ivy and ancient oak trees. It looked more like a fortress than a home, with high walls and narrow windows, but there was an undeniable aura of protection surrounding it. "Welcome to your new sanctuary," Damon said, stepping out of the car. "I suggest we get inside before the night grows any darker." Luna followed, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. Once inside, the heavy wooden door closed behind them with a resounding thud, and Damon lit several lanterns, casting the room in a warm golden glow. The interior was surprisingly well kept, with worn but elegant furniture, and shelves lined with ancient books. "Make yourselves at home," Damon said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged hall. "We'll start your training at dawn." Luna sank into an armchair, exhaustion washing over her. But sleep would not come easily tonight. She knew that with every passing moment, the darkness was closing in, and her fate was drawing closer. Marlo stood nearby, his hand never straying far from his weapon. Damon watched them both, his expression unreadable, as if weighing their strengths and weaknesses. Luna took a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The path before her was uncertain and perilous, but she had no choice but to follow it. Her story was just beginning, and the darkness had yet to reveal all its secrets. The first rays of dawn filtered through the narrow windows, casting long beams of light that seemed to fight against the encroaching darkness. Luna sat in one of the armchairs, sleep a distant memory as she clutched the silver pendant around her neck. It had become a talisman, a weight that reminded her of the power she still didn't understand. Marlo paced the room, his anxiety manifesting in the heavy thud of his boots on the wooden floor. He was a man used to fighting threats he could see, hold, or arrest, but now he found himself surrounded by mysteries and monsters, and his sense of helplessness gnawed at him. Damon watched him silently from across the room, his golden eyes glinting in the early light. "Your nervous energy is disruptive," he finally said, his voice like velvet yet carrying a hard edge. Marlo paused, shooting the vampire a glare. "Forgive me if I'm not entirely comfortable relying on someone who could tear my throat out in a heartbeat." Damon's lips curved into a half-smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "If I wanted to hurt either of you, Detective, you'd already be dead. But I suppose humans cling to their fears. It's what makes you so predictable." Before Marlo could retort, Luna stood, raising a hand between them. "Enough," she said, her voice tired but commanding. "We need to focus. If we're going to survive this, we can't keep fighting each other." Marlo bit back whatever words he was about to say, running a hand through his hair. He looked at Luna, and his expression softened. "You're right," he admitted. "I'm sorry." Damon's gaze shifted to her as well, his expression thoughtful. "Rest will only take you so far," he said to Luna. "We need to start your training. Your power is raw, undisciplined. If we don't harness it, it will draw more attention than you can handle." Luna felt a pang of anxiety at the thought. "What kind of training?" she asked. Damon's smile was fleeting, but there was something almost gentle in it. The kind that will test every limit you have and perhaps reveal strengths you didn't know you possessed. The training began in a clearing behind the sanctuary, a space that had once been used for rituals and gatherings centuries ago. Ancient stone pillars, cracked and covered in moss, marked the perimeter. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and earth, but an unnatural stillness hung over the place, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Luna stood in the center, feeling the energy of the place seep into her skin. Damon circled her, his movements graceful and deliberate, like a predator stalking prey. "You felt the power inside you," he began, his voice calm but authoritative. "It manifests as bursts of strength, visions, or sensations you can't explain. Magic is tied to emotion, and yours is wild because your emotions are too." Luna swallowed, thinking back to the night in the church when Alexander had cornered her. She remembered the surge of power, the rush of energy that had saved her life but left her terrified. "So, how do I control it?" she asked. Damon stopped, his gaze locking onto hers. "First, you have to understand it. Magic is a force that connects all things: life, death, light, shadow. You must find your center, your place in that web, and learn to draw from it without losing yourself." He held out his hand, and a flame appeared in his palm, flickering and dancing as if it had a life of its own. "Focus," he instructed, his eyes never leaving hers. "Reach out not with your hands, but with your mind. Feel the energy around you and draw it in." Luna stared at the flame, her pulse quickening. She closed her eyes, trying to block out everything but Damon's voice and the sensation of power lingering in the air. She could almost feel the energy, like threads woven into the fabric of the world, but grasping it felt impossible. Her frustration mounted, and the energy she was trying to control slipped from her grasp, sparking erratically around her. Damon stepped back just in time to avoid a burst of uncontrolled magic, and Luna's eyes flew open in horror. "I can't do this," she said, her voice cracking. "It's too much." Damon's expression was unreadable, but he didn't offer comfort. "Again," he commanded. Marlo, who had been watching from the edge of the clearing, took a step forward, concern etched on his face. "Take it easy on her," he said. "She's already exhausted." Damon's eyes flashed with impatience. "She doesn't have the luxury of taking it easy. If she doesn't master this, she'll be a danger to herself and everyone around her." Luna clenched her fists, anger flaring at Damon's harsh words. But as she let the emotion rise, she realized something. Her power responded to it. The energy inside her felt more accessible when she was angry, more focused. Taking a deep breath, she let herself feel the frustration, the fear, the overwhelming sense of unfairness that had followed her ever since she'd discovered the truth about her heritage. This time, when she reached for the energy, it came willingly, swirling around her in a soft, golden glow. Damon raised an eyebrow, a hint of approval in his gaze. "Better," he murmured. "Now channel it." Luna focused, her heart racing as she tried to shape the energy into something usable. She extended her hand, and to her astonishment, a small orb of light appeared, hovering above her palm. It pulsed with her heartbeat, fragile but beautiful. Marlo's eyes widened in awe, but Damon remained impassive. "Good," he said. "Now, hold it steady." The strain was immediate. Luna's arm trembled, and she could feel the magic slipping away, like water through her fingers. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her vision blurred. Just as she was about to lose control, Damon stepped forward, his hand covering hers. The connection between them was electric, and Luna gasped as his power flowed into her, steadying her magic. His golden eyes bore into hers, and for a moment the world fell away. It was just the two of them, bound together by something deeper than either of them could comprehend. "Feel that?" Damon whispered, his voice low and intimate. "That's what it feels like when you're in control. Remember it." Luna nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The orb of light slowly dissipated, and she sagged with exhaustion, Damon's hand the only thing keeping her upright. He released her, stepping back with a faint smile. "You're stronger than you think, Luna. But you still have a long way to go." Marlo hurried over, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "That's enough for today," he said firmly. "She needs to rest." Damon inclined his head, but there was a warning in his eyes. "Rest while you can," he said. "Alexander won't wait for you to be ready." The sanctuary was quiet that evening, the air thick with the scent of rain and pine. Luna sat on her bed, a candle flickering on the nightstand beside her. She felt bone-tired, but her mind refused to rest. Images of Damon, Marlo, and Alexander warred for dominance in her thoughts, each one more troubling than the last. The pendant around her neck pulsed faintly, a reminder of the power she carried. She ran her fingers over it, wondering what kind of responsibility she had truly inherited. Was she destined to become a guardian, a protector of this fragile balance between worlds? Or was she just a pawn in a much larger game, doomed to fail no matter how hard she tried? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She stood, her muscles protesting, and opened it to find Marlo standing there, a steaming mug in his hand. "Thought you could use some tea," he said, his smile warm but his eyes shadowed with worry. Luna took the mug, her fingers brushing his. "Thanks," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Marlo leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You did good out there today," he told her. "Better than I expected, honestly." Luna sipped the tea, the warmth soothing her frayed nerves. "It doesn't feel like it," she admitted. "It feels like I'm barely holding on." He frowned, his jaw tightening. "We'll get through this," he said. "I won't let anything happen to you." She looked up at him, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift. Marlo had always been her rock, the one constant in a world full of chaos. But now, even he seemed fragile, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What if I can't do this? What if I let everyone down?" Marlo moved closer, his hand cupping her cheek. "You won't," he said softly, "because you're not alone. We're in this together." Before Luna could respond, a chill swept through the room, extinguishing the candle. The shadows seemed to deepen, and a low, malevolent whisper echoed through the walls. "She's closer than you think," the voice hissed, sending a shiver down Luna's spine. Marlo drew his weapon, his body tensed for a fight. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The whisper faded, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Luna clutched her pendant, her heart pounding. Whatever they were up against, it was coming for them, and time was running out. The whispers left the room heavy with tension, and Luna's pulse echoed loudly in her ears. Marlo was still gripping his weapon, his hand trembling slightly, but his eyes remained resolute. For a moment, they just stood there, locked in the quiet aftermath of the unseen threat, trying to steady their breathing. Marlo lowered his gun slowly. "We need to stay vigilant," he said, but his voice was tight, lacking the usual confidence she relied on. Luna reached out, touching his arm lightly. "Hey," she said softly, searching his eyes. "We'll get through this. Together, remember?" Marlo's gaze softened, and he sighed, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "Yeah," he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheek in a gentle, familiar way. "I just hate feeling so powerless. Everything in my world used to make sense, and now I don't even know what I'm fighting." Luna stepped closer, their bodies almost touching, and the heat between them was suddenly impossible to ignore. Her heart raced, but for an entirely different reason now. She wanted to comfort him, to bridge the emotional chasm that had been growing between them since the night her world turned upside down. "You're not powerless," she whispered. "You've protected me from so much already. Just having you here makes all of this a little less terrifying." Marlo's eyes searched hers, his expression torn between vulnerability and something deeper, something he had been hiding for too long. He swallowed, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Luna," he said, his voice low and rough. Time seemed to stop, and the space between them shrank until his forehead rested against hers. The moment was charged, fraught with emotions they had both tried to suppress. It would be so easy to close the distance, to let go of the fear and pain, even if only for a fleeting second. But before they could take that final step, a sharp knock on the door shattered the intimacy. Luna jerked back, her heart pounding, as Marlo pulled away with a frustrated sigh. The interruption was like cold water thrown over both of them. Damon stood in the doorway, one eyebrow arched. I hate to interrupt whatever moment this is, he drawled, his golden eyes narrowing ever so slightly. But we have a situation. Luna stepped back, her face heating with embarrassment, but she forced herself to meet Damon's gaze. What happened? She asked, trying to compose herself. Damon stepped into the room, his presence commanding as always. The wards around the sanctuary are failing. Something or someone is actively working to dismantle them. We need to reinforce them now, or this place won't be safe much longer. Marlo's jaw clenched, and he holstered his weapon, the tender moment between him and Luna now buried beneath urgency. What do we need to do? He asked, all business once again. Damon's gaze flicked between the two of them, something unreadable in his eyes, before he focused on Luna. You need to help me, he said. The wards require power from a guardian's bloodline, and I need your strength. Luna's mouth went dry. The thought of sharing her magic again, of opening herself up to the world's strange and dangerous energy, made her shiver. But she knew there was no other choice. They couldn't afford to let the sanctuary's defenses fall. I'll do it, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Damon nodded, but he lingered for a moment, his gaze catching hers in that unnerving, intense way of his. Be careful, Luna, he murmured, almost too softly for Marlo to hear. Drawing too deeply from your magic will put you at risk. You'll need my help to stay grounded. There was a tension in his voice, something almost protective, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Marlo bristled beside her. She's stronger than you think, he snapped, and Damon's lips curled into the barest hint of a smile. Let's hope so, Damon replied smoothly, turning on his heel. Follow me. The three of them made their way to the sanctuary's perimeter, where the ancient wards were inscribed into the ground in an elaborate circle. The symbols were fading, pulsing weakly with a magic that should have been steady and strong. Luna knelt beside one of the symbols, her fingers tracing the intricate runes carved into the earth. She could feel the dying energy, like a heartbeat that was slowly losing its rhythm. How does this work? She asked, glancing up at Damon. He knelt beside her, his presence a dark and steady force that both comforted and unsettled her. The wards need to be recharged with magic, he explained. Your bloodline carries ancient power, and when combined with a catalyst, it can reinforce the spell. Luna swallowed, glancing at the silver dagger he pulled from his coat. The blade was sharp, gleaming even in the dim light. You need my blood? She asked, her voice wavering. Damon's gaze softened, and he reached out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was unexpected, sending a spark of warmth through her despite the dire circumstances. Just a drop, he said, and I'll be here to guide the magic to keep it from overwhelming you. Marlo shifted behind them, his expression stormy. Are you sure this is safe? He demanded, his protective instincts flaring. Damon's eyes flicked to Marlo, his jaw tightening. As safe as it can be, he replied. But if we don't do this, nothing else will matter. We'll be dead before dawn. Luna took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She extended her hand, her fingers trembling, and Damon held the dagger with surprising gentleness. His touch was cool, yet it seemed to sear into her skin, and she couldn't help the shiver that ran through her. Ready? He asked, his voice low, and she nodded, unable to speak. The blade bit into her palm, a sting of pain that quickly gave way to a warmth she hadn't expected. Her blood fell in slow, ruby drops onto the runes, and immediately the symbols began to glow, absorbing the magic with a hungry pulse. Luna gasped as energy surged through her, pulling at her magic and threatening to drown her in its intensity. She clenched her teeth, trying to hold on, but it felt like the world was spinning, slipping out of her grasp. Focus on me, Damon said, his hands cupping her face. His voice was a lifeline, and she clung to it desperately. Stay with me, Luna. Feel the energy, but don't let it consume you. His touch anchored her, and their connection felt like a flame, burning brightly against the darkness. She could feel his power intertwining with hers, steadying the storm inside her. It was intimate, overwhelming, and she couldn't help but lean into him, her body craving the stability he offered. The runes flared brighter, and she forced herself to breathe, to channel the magic as he instructed. Damon's gaze was locked on hers, and there was something almost tender in his expression, as if he saw something in her that she couldn't understand. Finally, the energy began to settle, the glow stabilizing until the runes pulsed with a steady light. Luna sagged with relief, but Damon's hands never left her, his fingers brushing the tear tracks on her cheeks. "You did well," he murmured, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable in his golden eyes. Before she could respond, Marlo pulled her back, wrapping his arms around her protectively. "That's enough," he said, glaring at Damon. "She needs to rest." Damon's expression hardened, and the moment between him and Luna shattered like glass. He stepped back, the familiar mask of indifference sliding over his face. "Fine," he said coolly, "but we'll need to continue tomorrow. The wards will only hold for so long." Marlo guided Luna back inside, his arm firm around her waist, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling a confusing mix of gratitude and longing. Damon's touch still lingered, and she hated how her body remembered it, craved it, even as she clung to Marlo's comfort. That night, sleep eluded Luna. Her body ached from the magic she had channeled, but her mind was far too restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Damon's hands on her skin, the way his voice had wrapped around her like a promise. She sat up, rubbing her face, and decided that maybe fresh air would help clear her thoughts. Slipping out of bed, she wrapped herself in a shawl and quietly left her room. The sanctuary was eerily silent, the halls bathed in shadows. She made her way to the courtyard, where the moonlight pooled like liquid silver, illuminating the old stone walls. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant whisper of the forest. Luna leaned against a pillar, trying to quiet the whirlwind of emotions inside her. But she wasn't alone for long. "Couldn't sleep either?" Damon's voice came from the shadows, smooth and familiar, and she turned to see him leaning casually against a nearby column. His dark hair caught the moonlight, and his eyes glowed softly, like embers in the dark. Her heart did a strange, traitorous flip. "No," she admitted. "Too much on my mind." He approached her, moving with the grace of a predator, and she held her breath as he stopped just a foot away. "Magic will do that," he said, his gaze tracing her face. "It leaves its mark, makes you feel things you don't understand." Luna swallowed, her mouth dry. "Is that why you seem so different?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Damon's smile was sad, almost wistful. "Different from what?" he asked, tilting his head. "From the monster I was taught to fear," she replied, meeting his gaze. "Sometimes you seem human." For a moment something flickered in his eyes, and he reached out, brushing his knuckles against her cheek. The touch was feather light, but it made her heart race. "I haven't felt human in a long time," he said, his voice low. "But you make me remember." Luna's breath caught, and she knew she should step back, put some distance between them. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed, drawn to the vulnerability in his eyes, the heat between them that felt like it could burn the world down. "Damon," she whispered, her voice trembling. He closed the distance between them, his lips so close she could feel his breath. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his eyes searching hers. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned into him, and when his mouth captured hers, it felt like falling into the deepest, darkest part of the night, where nothing else mattered. His kiss was possessive, hungry, as if he'd been holding back for too long, and she responded with a desperation she didn't know she had. His hands slid around her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted against him, the world blurring around them. It felt dangerous, thrilling, and oh so wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to care. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Damon rested his forehead against hers. "This is dangerous," he whispered, his voice filled with longing and regret. Luna's fingers curled into his shirt, holding him close. "I know," she whispered back, her heart racing. "But I don't care." Damon's eyes darkened, and he kissed her again, more softly this time, as if savoring every second. But before they could lose themselves further, the sound of a door slamming somewhere in the sanctuary made them break apart, their stolen moment shattered. Luna's chest heaved, her lips tingling, and she stepped back, reality crashing down around them. Damon's expression was carefully blank, but his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. "Go," he said, his voice rough, "before someone sees." She hesitated, her heart aching, but she nodded and slipped back inside, her mind and body still reeling from what had just happened. But as she crept back to her room, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. The lines between love and danger were blurring, and she wasn't sure she'd survive the fallout. Luna closed the door to her room softly, leaning against it as she tried to catch her breath. Her lips were still warm from Damon's kiss, and the memory of his touch burned in her mind. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, her heart racing as a storm of emotions flooded her. What had she just done? Her feelings for Damon were dangerous, reckless even. He was a vampire lord with secrets she couldn't begin to unravel, a predator lurking in the shadows of a world she barely understood. Yet every time she was near him, reason slipped through her fingers, leaving only the irresistible pull of attraction and the raw, unspoken connection they shared. A knock on her door startled her out of her thoughts, and she stiffened, her mind racing. Had someone seen her with Damon? She couldn't bear to think about what would happen if Marlo found out. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she opened the door. It was Marlo, his dark eyes filled with concern. "Luna, are you okay?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His gaze swept over her, lingering for a moment on the flush in her cheeks, and his expression hardened. "You look shaken. What happened?" Luna forced a smile, hoping it looked convincing. "I just needed some air," she lied, her voice light. "Everything that's happening, the wards failing, the whispers in the sanctuary, it's getting to me. I couldn't sleep." Marlo's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he reached out to touch her face. His fingers were warm, familiar, and she leaned into his palm, guilt twisting in her chest. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I should have stayed with you. I hate seeing you like this." His thumb brushed her cheek, and Luna closed her eyes, savoring the comfort he offered. She wanted to believe that being in his arms could chase away the confusion, the fear, and the dangerous attraction to Damon. Marlo had been her protector, her confidant, and she owed him her loyalty, didn't she? But the kiss with Damon lingered, searing her with guilt and desire. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. The worry in his eyes made her heart ache. He didn't deserve any of this, didn't deserve to be caught up in her turmoil. Marlo's expression softened, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and for a moment, the world felt safe again. But the peace was fleeting, tainted by the memory of Damon's lips on hers and the way his touch had set her blood on fire. Marlo tilted her chin up, his eyes searching hers. "No matter what happens, I'm here for you," he said. "We'll face whatever comes together." Luna nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wished she could tell him everything, but how could she admit that she was drawn to a monster, a vampire who stirred something dangerous in her heart? It was a secret she had to keep, for both their sakes. The next morning, the sanctuary was a hive of activity. Guardians and mages worked tirelessly to strengthen the wards, their faces strained with exhaustion and worry. Luna kept herself busy, helping wherever she could, but her mind was elsewhere. Damon was nowhere to be seen, and she told herself it was for the best. The last thing she needed was another encounter with him, another brush with the darkness she couldn't seem to resist. But deep down, a part of her longed to see him again, to understand the connection between them. "Luna!" A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Ava, one of the younger guardians, hurrying toward her. Ava's face was flushed, her red hair wild from running. "I need your help with the wards on the east side. There, acting strange." Luna followed Ava, her curiosity piqued. The eastern wards were supposed to be the strongest, fortified by layers of old magic. If something was wrong with them, it meant the sanctuary was in more danger than she had realized. As they reached the eastern perimeter, Luna felt it immediately. The air was thick with tension, the magic here erratic and unstable. The runes carved into the ground flickered, their glow pulsing in an unsettling rhythm. "What's causing this?" Luna asked, kneeling beside one of the runes. She could feel the magic pulsing beneath her fingers, almost like a heartbeat, but it was off-kilter, unnatural. Ava shook her head, her eyes wide. "We don't know. Damon was supposed to check it out, but he hasn't shown up. Some of the guardians think he might be. Her words were cut off by a sudden chill in the air. Luna's breath fogged in front of her, and a dark shadow slithered across the ground, moving faster than any living creature. Ava yelped, stumbling back as the shadow coiled around the runes, suffocating their light. Luna's heart raced. "Get back," she ordered, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. Ava obeyed, retreating to a safer distance as Luna called on her magic. The pendant around her neck glowed softly, and she focused her energy, trying to push the shadow back. But the darkness resisted, as if it were alive, and Luna could feel it pressing against her magic, suffocating her power. Panic flared in her chest, but she refused to give in. Gritting her teeth, she poured more energy into the wards, willing them to hold. "Luna." The voice was calm, familiar, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to see Damon standing behind her, his expression grim. "You can't fight it alone." He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at the shadow, and the air around him pulsed with power. Luna's breath caught as she felt his magic, dark and commanding, wash over her. It was a reminder of who he was, what he was, but she couldn't deny the relief that coursed through her. Damon extended his hand, and Luna hesitated for only a second before taking it. His grip was firm, and the connection between them flared to life, sending a rush of heat through her. Together, they focused their magic on the shadow, and slowly it began to retreat, slithering back into the darkness from which it came. When the shadow was gone, the wards stabilized, their light steady once more. Luna released a shaky breath, her body trembling from the effort. Damon didn't let go of her hand, his touch grounding her as she tried to regain her strength. "You did well," he said, his voice low. There was something unreadable in his eyes, a mix of pride and something deeper, something that made her heart ache. Luna pulled her hand away, her cheeks flushing. "I had help," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Damon's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful, Luna," he said softly. "The darkness is growing stronger, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." Before she could ask what he meant, he stepped back, his expression closing off. He turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her with more questions than answers, and a heart that couldn't decide which way it was being pulled. Luna spent the rest of the day in a daze, her mind racing. The sanctuary was under siege from a darkness she didn't understand, and her own heart was at war. Every time she thought about Damon, about the kiss they had shared, guilt and desire twisted inside her. And then there was Marlo, steadfast and protective, the person she should trust the most. But everything was spiraling out of control, and she felt like she was losing herself in the chaos. That evening, she found herself in the training hall, desperate for a distraction. She picked up one of the practice staffs and began running through the drills Marlo had taught her, focusing on the rhythm of her movements. The physical exertion helped, but it couldn't chase away the confusion in her heart. "Taking out your frustration on the practice dummy?" Marlo's voice came from behind her, and she spun around, surprised to see him leaning against the doorway. He gave her a lopsided grin, but his eyes were tired, the weight of everything they were facing evident. Luna tried to smile back, but it felt forced. "Just trying to clear my head," she admitted, lowering the staff. Marlo crossed the room, his smile fading. "I'm worried about you," he said, his voice soft. "You've been distant. Ever since this started, it feels like you're slipping away." Her chest tightened, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm trying to keep it together," she said, "but everything is so overwhelming." He stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone," he whispered, his eyes filled with concern and something deeper, something that made her heart ache. Luna felt the tears welling up, and she hated how vulnerable she felt. But before she could speak, Marlo leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead in a tender, protective gesture. She closed her eyes, wishing she could let herself fall into his embrace. Let him be her anchor in the storm. But the memory of Damon's kiss haunted her, a ghost she couldn't shake. Luna couldn't sleep that night. Marlo's words and Damon's warnings replayed in her mind, tangling together in a storm of confusion and guilt. She paced her room, the moonlight spilling through the narrow window and illuminating the restless shadows. Her pendant felt heavier than usual, as if the magic within it was reacting to her turmoil. She clenched it tightly in her fist, as if the tiny, glowing stone could offer her some kind of clarity. But the storm inside her heart only grew wilder. A gentle knock on her door startled her out of her thoughts, and she tensed. It was late, and most of the sanctuary's inhabitants had retired for the night. Heart pounding, she crossed the room and opened the door. It was Damon. He stood there, cloaked in shadows, his expression unreadable. The flickering torchlight from the corridor painted his face in harsh lines, making him look both impossibly beautiful and achingly dangerous. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. There was no command, no arrogance, only a vulnerability that made her chest ache. Luna swallowed, torn between the impulse to let him in and the urge to slam the door shut, but she knew she couldn't keep running from him. Stepping back, she opened the door wider, and he stepped inside. The room felt smaller with him in it, the air crackling with tension. Damon's presence was overpowering, a constant reminder of the magnetic pull she couldn't resist. He took in her rumpled state, the exhaustion in her eyes, and his jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," he began, and the sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "For everything I've dragged you into, for the danger, the confusion, and for making things harder for you." Luna's breath hitched. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it hadn't been an apology. "You didn't force any of this," she whispered, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. "I made my choices too." Damon's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer. "But I complicate things for you, don't I?" There was a bitterness in his tone, but also a raw, unguarded pain. "Marlo, he's everything I'm not. Safe, steady, and he loves you. Anyone can see that." Luna's throat tightened, and she felt the sting of tears. "Damon," he reached out, his hand hovering near her face, but he didn't touch her. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking, "but I can't stay away. You're in my blood, Luna. You make me feel things I thought were lost to me, things I'm not supposed to feel." The depth of his confession left her breathless. Damon, the immortal vampire who commanded legions and inspired terror, was admitting his weakness for her. It should have terrified her, but instead, her heart ached with longing. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and this time, he did touch her. His thumb brushed away the tears, his touch unbearably gentle. Luna closed her eyes, leaning into his palm despite the warning bells in her mind. She knew she was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, but she couldn't stop herself from falling. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I feel like I'm being torn apart. I care about Marlo, but you're always there, in my head, in my heart." Damon's hand moved to cradle her cheek, and he leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but I can't give you up." He kissed her then, a slow, desperate kiss that seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. Luna responded without hesitation, her hands tangling in his hair as she pulled him closer. The kiss was fire and shadows, a collision of want and need that left her dizzy. But reality crashed back into her like a wave. She pulled away, her chest heaving, and stepped back. "We can't. We shouldn't," she said, her voice trembling. "There's too much at stake. The darkness, the sanctuary. Marlo." Damon's eyes were filled with a torment that mirrored her own. "You're right," he said, but some things are impossible to fight." The following day, the air in the sanctuary was heavy with tension. Word had spread about the wards failing, and the shadows breaching their defenses, and everyone was on edge. Luna tried to focus on her duties, but she felt like she was walking through a fog. Marlo found her in the library, surrounded by ancient tomes on warding magic. He sat across from her, his expression troubled. "Luna," he said, his voice soft, "something's changed. I can feel it. You're different." Her heart clenched, and she met his gaze, guilt gnawing at her. "I'm just tired," she lied, her voice brittle. "Everything happening with the sanctuary is overwhelming." Marlo reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, familiar, and it made her want to cry. "You don't have to carry this burden alone," he said, his eyes full of concern. "You're not alone, Luna. Remember that." Tears threatened to spill, but she forced herself to stay composed. Marlo was her anchor, the person she had always relied on, and here she was, keeping secrets from him, betraying his trust. "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Thank you." But even as she said the words, Damon's kiss lingered on her lips, a ghost that wouldn't let her go. That night, the sanctuary was eerily quiet. The usual hum of magic that protected the place felt thin, fragile. Luna sat on her bed, her hands trembling as she tried to summon her magic. The pendant around her neck glowed faintly, but it felt weaker than usual. A sudden noise outside her window made her jump. Heart pounding, she moved to the window and peered out. The courtyard was shrouded in shadows, but she could make out a figure moving with preternatural grace. Damon. He was standing near one of the ancient oak trees, his head tilted as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Luna's pulse quickened, and before she could think better of it, she grabbed her cloak and slipped outside. The night air was cold, biting at her skin, but she barely felt it. She approached Damon cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the grass. "Damon," she called softly. He turned, his expression grave. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice tense. "The wards are failing faster than we thought. Something is coming." Luna shivered, not just from the cold, but from the fear that his words ignited. "What is it? What are we facing?" Damon's jaw clenched, and he looked away, his eyes searching the darkness. "Something ancient," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A shadow that wants to consume everything, and it's drawn to power, your power." Luna's stomach twisted. "My power? But why me?" He stepped closer, his eyes burning with a fierce protectiveness. "Because you're the light in the dark," he said. "And the shadows always hunger for the brightest flame." Luna's heart raced, and she reached for his hand, clinging to the warmth he offered. The lines between love and duty, desire and fear were blurring, and she didn't know how to untangle them. But one thing was clear, whatever was coming, she would need every ounce of strength she had, and she would need both Damon and Marlo by her side, even if it meant tearing her heart apart. Luna's breath misted in the cold night air as she stood beside Damon, the weight of his words pressing down on her. The sanctuary, her home and refuge, was vulnerable, and whatever ancient darkness loomed on the horizon was coming for her. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but Damon's steady presence kept her from spiraling into panic. "Damon," she whispered, her voice raw with fear, "if this thing is coming for me, what chance do we have?" His eyes softened, and he reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender that it made her heart ache. "We'll protect you," he vowed, his voice fierce and unyielding. "I will protect you. Even if it means going to war with the shadows themselves." She wanted to believe him, but the burden of her power, the light within her that had always set her apart, felt heavier than ever. And the more she considered the danger she posed to those she cared about, the more guilt twisted in her gut. "What if protecting me isn't enough?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What if the darkness takes me and uses me against you all?" Damon's expression darkened, his jaw clenching. "I won't let that happen. You're stronger than you think, Luna, but we have to be prepared." Before she could respond, the wind picked up, carrying with it a bone-deep chill that made Luna shudder. Damon stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. The night seemed to darken further, the stars winking out one by one as an oppressive, unnatural silence settled over the courtyard. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Luna's blood ran cold. It was cloaked in darkness, its face obscured, but she could feel the malevolence radiating from it. The air seemed to thrum with its presence, and Luna instinctively took a step back. "Ah, the light-bearer," the shadowy figure murmured, its voice a distorted, echoing hiss. "How brightly you burn, even now. No wonder the darkness seeks to consume you." Damon stepped in front of Luna, his body taut with barely restrained fury. "You don't belong here," he growled. "Leave or I'll make you." The figure tilted its head, as if considering Damon's threat. "You think your defiance matters, vampire?" it taunted. "The end has already begun. Your precious sanctuary will fall, And she, it pointed a skeletal shadow-wreathed finger at Luna, will be the key to its undoing. Luna's heart raced, fear threatening to choke her. But a surge of determination flared within her, and she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You're wrong," she said. "I won't be your pawn. I won't let the darkness win." The figure let out a low, bone-chilling laugh. "We shall see," it whispered, and then it melted back into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there. The oppressive weight lifted, and the stars returned, twinkling innocently in the sky. But Luna knew the danger hadn't passed. It was only just beginning. Damon turned to her, his eyes filled with worry. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentler now, the anger from moments before replaced by deep concern. Luna nodded, though she felt anything but fine. "We need to warn everyone," she said. "The sanctuary has to be ready for whatever's coming." By the time dawn broke, the sanctuary was a hive of activity. Luna and Damon had gathered the guardians, mages, and other inhabitants, warning them of the impending threat. Marlo stood beside Luna, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. She could feel the tension in his body, the worry he tried so hard to mask. "This is worse than we feared," Marlo said, his voice grim as he addressed the gathered crowd. "The wards are failing, and the darkness is targeting Luna. We have to strengthen our defenses and prepare for an attack." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Luna felt the weight of their fear. She knew they were looking at her, wondering why the darkness had chosen her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but she straightened her spine and met their gazes head-on. "We have to stay united," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Damon lingered at the edge of the crowd, his eyes never leaving her. She could feel his presence, a constant, unspoken promise of protection. But Marlo was there too, his warmth and loyalty a reminder of everything she stood to lose. The sanctuary began preparations immediately. Guardians trained in the courtyards, mages fortified the crumbling wards, and watchtowers were manned day and night. The tension was palpable, but there was also a sense of grim determination. Late that afternoon, Luna found a moment to herself in the sanctuary's garden. The scent of wildflowers filled the air, and she closed her eyes, letting the sunlight warm her face. For a brief moment, she pretended everything was normal, that the sanctuary wasn't on the brink of destruction, and that her heart wasn't torn in two. Marlo approached her, his footsteps soft on the grass. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice gentle. Luna opened her eyes and offered him a small smile. "Of course." He sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the sky. "I miss this," he said quietly. "The peace, before everything got so complicated." Luna's throat tightened, and she reached for his hand. "I miss it too," she whispered. "But we'll get through this. We have to." Marlo's fingers laced with hers, and he turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers. "Luna, I know you're carrying more than you're telling me," he said. "I don't need to know everything, but I need to know you're not slipping away from me." Guilt twisted in her chest, but she couldn't lie to him. "Marlo, she faltered, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to be strong, but everything feels so wrong. I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to make sense of any of this." Marlo leaned in, his forehead touching hers. "You're not alone," he whispered. "No matter what happens, I'm here." Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced herself to smile, grateful for his unwavering love. "Thank you," she murmured. That evening, Luna stood on the balcony overlooking the sanctuary, the cool breeze tugging at her hair. She felt the exhaustion deep in her bones, but sleep was elusive. The darkness, the threat, Damon's kiss, it all haunted her. "You're not getting any rest, are you?" Damon's voice was soft as he joined her on the balcony. She didn't turn to look at him, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. "I can't," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's a mess, and I feel like it's my fault." "It's not," he said, his voice firm. "You didn't choose this. The darkness was drawn to you, but that doesn't make you responsible for it." Luna finally turned to face him, her heart aching with everything she felt for him. Desire, confusion, fear. "Damon, if things go wrong, if the darkness takes me." He cut her off, stepping closer, his eyes blazing. "I won't let that happen," he said fiercely. "Not while I'm still breathing." She wanted to believe him, but the vulnerability in his voice made her chest tighten. You keep saying that, but what if? Damon closed the distance between them, his hands cupping her face. Stop thinking about what if, he said, his voice a raw, desperate whisper. Think about now. Think about us. The last of Luna's resistance crumbled, and she let herself be swept away by the intensity of his gaze. When he kissed her, it was a clash of longing and desperation, a reminder of everything that made her heart race and her mind blur. She kissed him back, losing herself in the heat and the darkness. But then the sound of footsteps behind them made her pull away, her breath catching in her throat. Marlo stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with hurt and disbelief. Luna? Marlo's voice cracked, and Luna's heart shattered at the sight of the betrayal etched on his face. Damon stepped back, his jaw tightening, but he didn't apologize. Luna's hands shook as she tried to find the words, but nothing came. Marlo's hurt gaze flicked between them, and then he turned and walked away. Luna's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. What have I done? She whispered, her world crumbling around her. Damon knelt beside her, his hand hovering near hers. You followed your heart, he said, his voice gentle but pained, even if it hurts. But Luna wasn't sure if following her heart had saved her or doomed them all. Luna felt as if the world had shattered around her. Marlo's retreating figure burned itself into her memory, his expression a kaleidoscope of anguish and betrayal. She struggled to catch her breath, each sob tearing through her with a force she hadn't anticipated. Damon stayed beside her, silent and unmoving, his presence both a comfort and a cruel reminder of the choice that had just broken everything. His hand hovered near hers, and for a moment he looked as though he wanted to reach for her, to comfort her. But he held back. Luna, he murmured, his voice thick with regret. I'm sorry. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. It's not your fault, she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. I let this happen. I hurt him. Damon's jaw tightened, and a storm of emotions flickered in his dark eyes. Guilt, frustration, longing. You can't be everything to everyone, he said softly. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, someone gets hurt. His words were a bitter truth she didn't want to accept, but she knew he was right. She wiped at her tears, forcing herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady, but she couldn't stay crumpled on the balcony floor. She had to face what she'd done. I have to talk to him, she said, her voice hoarse. I have to try to make this right. Damon stood too, his presence looming beside her. Do you want me to come with you? Luna hesitated, her heart aching. She had found a connection with Damon that she couldn't ignore, but Marlo had been her rock, her steadfast anchor in a world full of chaos. She couldn't make things worse by bringing Damon along. No, she said softly. This is something I have to do alone. Damon nodded, though she could see how much it pained him. I'll be here if you need me, he said, and for a moment the raw vulnerability in his voice made her want to cry all over again. Luna forced herself to leave him, the weight of her actions pressing down on her with every step. She found Marlo in the sanctuary's training yard, his sword slicing through the air in a series of precise, powerful movements. His face was set in a mask of concentration, his body tense with barely restrained energy. But even from a distance, Luna could see the pain etched in his features. She hesitated at the edge of the yard, her heart in her throat. She knew this conversation would be one of the hardest of her life, but she couldn't run from it. Marlo, she called softly. He paused mid-swing, the sword freezing in place. For a moment, he didn't turn around, and Luna's stomach twisted painfully. Finally, he lowered the blade and faced her, his blue eyes stormy with hurt and disbelief. Luna, he said, his voice carefully controlled, but she could hear the crack beneath the surface. What do you want? Luna's hands clenched into fists at her sides, the weight of his anguish pressing down on her. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen. Marlo's jaw tightened, and he set the sword down, wiping his hands on his tunic. But it did, he said, his voice flat. I trusted you, Luna, I thought. He trailed off, his throat working as he swallowed back the raw emotion. I thought you loved me. Tears pricked her eyes again, and she took a shaky step closer. I do love you, she whispered. I care about you more than I can even put into words. But things got so complicated. Complicated? Marlo echoed, his voice rising. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling over. Is that what you call kissing him? Letting him? He cut himself off, his face contorting with pain. I've always known he was dangerous, that he would ruin everything. But I didn't think you'd let him get this close. Luna flinched at the accusation, guilt tearing at her. It wasn't like that, she pleaded. I didn't plan for any of this. Damon, he makes me feel things I don't understand. But that doesn't mean I wanted to hurt you. Marlo's eyes flashed with anger, and he took a step back, putting more distance between them. I don't understand, Luna. After everything we've been through, after all the times I've been there for you, why him? The question was a knife to her heart, and she struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound like a betrayal. Because he's different, she said finally, her voice cracking. Because he challenges me in ways I didn't expect. Because I can't control what I feel, and that terrifies me. Marlo's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked utterly defeated. So where does that leave us? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Am I just supposed to stand by and watch while you figure out what you want? Luna's tears spilled over, and she wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold and lost. I don't want to lose you, she said. I don't want to lose what we have. He shook his head, his expression pained. Maybe it's already too late, he said, his voice breaking. Because right now, I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way. Luna's heart shattered at his words, and she took a step back, her vision blurring with tears. She had thought she could fix this, that she could somehow hold on to both Damon and Marlo without destroying everything. But now it felt like she had lost everything that mattered. Marlo picked up his sword and walked away, leaving Luna standing alone in the training yard, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like a suffocating shroud. Luna wandered through the sanctuary, numb and broken. The whispers of the inhabitants followed her, and she knew rumors were spreading like wildfire. Everyone knew something had happened between her, Marlo, and Damon, and it only added to the chaos and uncertainty that had taken hold of their refuge. As she passed through the main hall, she heard footsteps approaching. Heroine, one of the elder guardians and a respected healer, stopped in front of her. Her eyes, usually warm and kind, were now filled with worry. Luna, Heroine said gently, you need... The sanctuary's magic is weakening, and we need your strength more than ever. Luna managed a weak nod, but she couldn't find the words to respond. Rest was the last thing on her mind, but she knew she couldn't afford to fall apart, not when the darkness was closing in on them. Heroine's expression softened. You carry a heavy burden, she said, but remember, even the brightest flame can flicker. Take care of yourself, or the shadows will consume you. Luna swallowed hard, the healer's words hitting too close to home. She knew she was running on empty, her magic strained and her heart shattered, but she couldn't let herself falter, not now. Night fell once more, and the sanctuary was on high alert. Watchtowers were manned, and the guardians patrolled the perimeter, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. Luna stood on the sanctuary's battlements, the wind tugging at her hair as she gazed out into the forest. The shadows seemed thicker than ever, creeping closer with each passing hour. Damon joined her, his presence a shadow that she couldn't ignore. He stood beside her, silent for a moment, before finally speaking. I saw Marlo leave, he said quietly. It didn't go well, did it? Luna's heart clenched, and she didn't trust herself to look at him. I hurt him, she admitted, her voice raw, maybe more than I can ever fix. Damon's hand hovered near hers, but he didn't touch her. You did what you had to, he said, though there was an edge of sadness in his voice. This isn't your fault. The darkness has been tearing us all apart long before now. She turned to face him, the weight of everything pressing down on her. But what if it is my fault? She whispered. What if I'm the reason everything is falling apart? Damon's gaze softened, and he reached out, finally taking her hand. His touch was warm, grounding her in a way she desperately needed. You're not the cause of the darkness, he said. You're the reason we have a chance to fight it. Don't forget that. Luna looked up at him, her heart aching with everything she felt for him. Love, longing, fear. The lines between them were blurred, and she didn't know how to make sense of it all. But Damon's unwavering belief in her gave her a sliver of hope. Before she could respond, a shout rang out from one of the watchtowers. The guardians sprang into action, and Luna's heart leapt into her throat. "The shadows are coming!" a voice called, panic rippling through the sanctuary. Luna's blood turned to ice as she looked out over the battlements. The darkness was no longer a distant threat. It was here, creeping closer, ready to consume them all. Damon squeezed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We fight together," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing around them. Luna took a deep breath, her fear battling with the determination that burned within her. "Together," she agreed, her voice strong. As the shadows surged forward, Luna knew that the coming battle would test everything they had. Love, loyalty, and power would collide, and the future of the sanctuary and her heart hung in the balance. The air grew thick with tension as Luna and Damon stood together on the battlements, gazing out over the horizon. The sky had shifted, dark clouds gathering in the distance like an approaching storm, mirroring the weight of the battle that loomed ahead. The sanctuary, once a place of peace and safety, now felt like a fragile shell, waiting to be cracked open by the encroaching darkness. Luna's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the pull of the shadows, dark, insidious, whispering her name from the depths of the earth. The strange power inside her surged again, like a dormant beast awakening. It terrified her, and yet, in some twisted way, it felt like it was calling to her, urging her to embrace it. "Don't let it consume you." Damon's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. She turned to him, finding his expression softened with concern, though there was a steely determination in his eyes. "I don't want it to," Luna whispered. "But what if it's the only thing that can stop them?" Damon's jaw tightened and he took a step closer to her, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "You are more than the darkness inside you, Luna. You're not just a weapon to be wielded. You're a light that even the shadows can't completely snuff out." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But the darkness, it felt like it had always been a part of her, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sound of boots on stone interrupted her thoughts. Marlo approached, his face set in grim lines, the weight of his own conflict evident in his posture. Luna's heart squeezed painfully at the sight of him, still carrying the weight of their fractured bond. He stopped a few paces away, his gaze locking with hers. There was no anger in his eyes, only sadness, and something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry," Luna said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what else to say. She had hurt him, and no words could undo the damage. Marlo shook his head, his eyes flickering to Damon for a moment before returning to Luna. "I know, but we don't have time for this." His tone softened slightly, and Luna could hear the strain in it. "We have to focus on the battle ahead. The darkness isn't going to wait for us to figure things out." Luna nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "You're right, we need to prepare." The days leading up to the battle were a whirlwind of preparation. The sanctuary was alive with activity, guardians and mages working together to reinforce the magical wards that had been steadily weakening. Weapons were sharpened, armor repaired, and strategies discussed in hushed voices. But despite the outward bustle, there was an undeniable sense of unease that clung to everyone. Luna spent the majority of her time with the mages, helping them stabilize the protective magic that surrounded the sanctuary. She was starting to understand more about her own abilities, though it terrified her how much untapped power lay dormant within her, just waiting for the right moment to surface. But with every lesson she learned, the more she realized how little she truly understood about the darkness that was coming for her. The ancient evil that sought to claim her was not just a physical force. It was a corruptive, manipulative entity, one that preyed on her deepest fears and weaknesses. It had been following her for as long as she could remember, waiting for the moment when she would be the most vulnerable. The darkness knew her better than she knew herself. One evening, after a long day of reinforcing the wards, Luna found herself alone in the sanctuary's garden, the last remnants of sunlight fading into twilight. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. She knelt beside the fountain, running her fingers through the cool water as if trying to cleanse herself of the fear and doubt swirling inside her. But it wasn't working. The shadows were drawing closer, and with each passing hour, she felt more like a pawn in some twisted game she didn't understand. "You look lost," a voice said, startling her. Luna turned to find Damon standing just behind her, his eyes soft with concern. She hadn't heard him approach, but in that moment she was grateful for his presence. "I am," she admitted, wiping her hands on her pants as she stood up. "I don't know what to do anymore." Damon didn't say anything at first. He simply took a step toward her, his eyes searching hers as if looking for something buried deep beneath the surface. "You don't have to do this alone," he said finally, his voice low and earnest. "Whatever happens, I'm with you. You don't have to face the darkness by yourself." Luna felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had been pushing everyone away, afraid of what her choices would do to them. But in this moment, standing in the garden with Damon, she realized how much she needed him. "I don't want to lose you," she said quietly, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even herself. Damon's expression softened, and he reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "You won't," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Luna held onto his hand, feeling a strange comfort in his words. But deep down, she knew the battle ahead would change everything. No matter how much they fought, no matter how strong their bond, the shadows were closing in, and soon they would all be forced to face what had been building for so long. The night arrived with an unsettling stillness, the air heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. The guardians stood at their posts, ready for battle, while the mages continued their chants, their hands weaving complex spells meant to hold back the impending. The sanctuary itself seemed to hold its breath, every crack and crevice filled with an eerie silence. Luna stood at the front of the battlements, her heart hammering in her chest. Beside her, Damon and Marlo stood as sentinels, their faces grim but resolute. Their eyes met briefly, and Luna could feel the unspoken tension between them, the fracture of their once solid friendship now an undeniable rift. "Are you ready?" Damon asked, his voice steady. Luna nodded, though she didn't feel ready at all. The magic swirling within her felt wild and uncontrollable, like a storm threatening to break loose. She wasn't sure she could control it, let alone use it to fight the shadows. But she couldn't back down now, not when everything she cared about was at stake. Suddenly, a distant guttural growl echoed through the air, followed by a rush of movement from the forest beyond the sanctuary walls. The shadows had arrived. The first wave was a dark, twisted mass of creatures that Luna had only ever heard about in the ancient texts, nightmarish beings that moved with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing with hunger and malice. They surged toward the sanctuary as if they could smell the fear in the air. "Hold your ground!" shouted Marlo, his voice carrying across the battlements. The guardians raised their weapons, and the mages intensified their spells, sending waves of magic out into the night. But Luna knew it wouldn't be enough. The darkness was more than just creatures. It was an insidious force, and no amount of magic could push it back entirely. The mages could hold the line for a while, but they would need more than just power to survive this. As the first wave of shadows collided with the sanctuary's defenses, Luna felt a pull in her chest, a strange magnetic force drawing her toward the heart of the chaos. Her eyes widened as her magic surged in response, its power thrumming beneath her skin, desperate to be unleashed. "Luna!" Damon's voice broke through her thoughts. "Don't do this!" But it was already. Luna's hand shot out, and a wave of blinding light exploded from her palm, sending the nearest shadows tumbling back. The ground cracked beneath her feet, and the air crackled with energy as the light swirled around her, responding to her will. But as the power surged, Luna felt something else, something darker lurking within the magic. The shadows recoiled from the light, but they weren't defeated. Instead, they seemed to grow more determined, more vicious. And in the midst of it all, Luna realized the truth. The darkness wasn't just after her. It wanted to merge with her, to twist her into something unrecognizable. Her heart raced as she struggled to keep control, the power inside her clawing at her, trying to break free. But she couldn't. Not yet. Damon was by her side in an instant, his eyes filled with urgency. "Luna, fight it! Don't let it take you!" Luna fought to push back the encroaching darkness, her mind battling against the surge of power that threatened to consume her. She couldn't let it win, not when so much was at stake. The battle raged on, but Luna could feel herself slipping. The shadows clawed at the edges of her consciousness, whispering promises of power, of an end to the pain. But in the depths of her heart, she knew the truth. If she gave in, if she let the darkness consume her, she would destroy everything she loved. Damon's voice broke through the storm of her thoughts. "Luna, you're stronger than this." She turned to him, her eyes wide with desperation. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on, Damon. It's too much." But Damon didn't give up. He reached out, grabbing her by the shoulders, his touch grounding her. "You're not alone," he said, his voice fierce. "You don't have to fight this on your own. We're in this together." Luna closed her eyes, drawing strength from his words. The connection between them was a lifeline in the storm, a tether to the light she was desperately trying to hold on to. She had to fight, for him, for Marlo, for everyone in the sanctuary. With a final surge of will, Luna pushed the darkness back, forcing it into the recesses of her mind. The light in her hands flared, brighter than ever before, and the shadows recoiled, shrieking in pain. But Luna knew this was only the beginning. The darkness had been defeated for now, but it wasn't gone. Not yet. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means a lot and helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next